Hi, Mark Aylward here with Seven Pillars. You've arrived here in the professional track of our training, and specifically, this is about getting prepared for a job interview. So, what I'm about to do here is sit down with a friend of mine, Alex, at a local coffee shop and prepare him for an interview that he'll be going on the day after we record this interview. And it's for a position that I've never prepared someone for before. So, I think you'll find that it's kind of magical that most of what I do in helping people prepare for interviews kind of transcends industry, job position, seniority, compensation. Most of it's the same. So obviously I can't cover everything that would cover every circumstance in every interview because they're all unique, but I think you'll get a vast majority of what you'd need to know to prepare for an interview. It is in a coffee shop, so I apologize in advance for the quality of the recording, but it's good enough. My voice is pretty clear. The other unique thing about it is because of the noise, I wasn't able to get Alex's side of the conversation, and I was at the beginning kind of upset with that. But as I listened to it and edited it down and put some slides on top of it, I think it's a much more efficient use of your time because not that you wouldn't benefit from hearing Alex's side, but I think because I repeat a lot of what he says and put things in context, it's unnecessary and it saves you 20, 25 minutes. So anyway, listen closely, take some notes, and if you're nervous about interviewing or you're about to go on an interview or you just think you might want to brush up, I think you're really going to enjoy this. Thanks. This is my friend Alex, and I am going to help Alex go through the preparation process for an interview that he's got tomorrow face to face. I think at one of the local hospitals, Alex, is that correct? Well, let's just kind of conduct this like, just a casual conversation, I think, because that's the way I would advise people to conduct interviews more often than not. Give me a little background on what's going to happen tomorrow. Do you know who you're going to talk to, and tell me a little bit about the position, and give me a little kind of background on the whole scenario. So I understand the liaison position. It's kind of a customer care position, it sounds like. So let me ask you this from a layman's standpoint, because I'm not a healthcare guy per se. I know you've worked in healthcare for a long time. If you do your job well, how does that work to the advantage of the physician? And the reverse, if you do your job poorly, what is the pain that causes the physician? So do you work for the doctors, or who do you work for? Okay, so this is a function of the hospital. Your interaction with the doctors just happens to be very high in this particular role. Okay, and how are you compensated? And so, is there a particular person that you report to in this role at the hospital? So, who are you going to be interviewing with tomorrow? And so, would either one of them be the person that you're going to report to that would review you? And the 10 team members, there's one in each hospital within that particular region. So you're responsible for the entire hospital with regard to this particular function. Okay, so you're on site every day. What's a CME? So that I understand correctly, the CME is an acronym. And what is the C and the M and the E? What do they stand for? Something. Okay, but those are classes that you attend. Okay. So these classes are keeping the physicians up to date on modern procedural issues, modern technology, everything that has to refresher courses. Okay. Okay. So what I'm trying to get to with you, Alex, is I'm trying to get to where are the areas of opportunity for you from a performance standpoint. That's why I've asked you to kind of describe the job. So number one, I can understand how well you understand the job. And number two, how you can best position yourself tomorrow in the interview based on what they expect out of you for the job. What kind of information do you have on these two young ladies? Do they have LinkedIn profiles? Have you spoken to them on the phones before? So let me volunteer this, because again, I think this is true independent of the type of job that you have or anything like that. This is a cultural thing that you're talking about here. I would suggest to you that the word rumor is probably not one that you want to use in the interview process. It's just like not using the word problem and using the word challenge. It's nuance, but I think it's very important, particularly when you're in this dating process of, let's get to know each other and who's who. But I would think the way that I would suggest that you address that part of your responsibility, which sounds like a major part of your responsibility, is asking these young ladies, what do you guys think is the biggest challenge that if I could help you overcome that challenge right now, as it exists right now in the hospital between the physicians and everyone else they interact with, what could you use the most help with right now? And I think that would be a great way for you to flush out this rumor that you've been given through another source, so that it becomes you being proactive. That's a very intelligent question, and you're also getting the answer from the horse's mouth. It's not a rumor. It's their perception of what their biggest challenge is. Does that make sense? Okay, I would bring that with me as a primary question. Well, I think there's two things about that, right? One is I want to know the answer to that question as early on in the interview as I possibly can, but I don't want it to appear to be self-serving, because if you can get the answer to that question early on, then you can tailor all of your answers to be focused on how you would provide that solution, right? And this is true of any interview that you might go on. He who speaks first loses in most negotiations. So ask them what they could use help with and try to get that in early, and then try and keep that in perspective when you are answering your other questions that they might ask you throughout the course of the interview. Okay? So it's interesting that you don't have any background on them, nor can you get your hands on any. Let's back up just a second. You've had how many phone conversations with these people? And so who was the phone conversation with? Do you have the title of that person? Okay. So you're being introduced to these people in part because there's a credible resource internally that's personally vouching for you. Okay, that's great. That's great. Let me ask you a couple more kind of logistics questions. Any idea how many candidates are being considered? Okay. And out of the 50 people that applied, does that mean there are 25 people going in for face-to-face interviews, or 25 people that they spoke to on the phone for each position going in? Okay. Okay. So there's a lot of competition. So if you had mentioned that you feel well suited for the job, articulate to me specifically why you're qualified to do the job. Because that's going to be part of what I want you to bring to the conversation. So you've got, and again, I'm in terms of me trying to help you understand your audience, not to be presumptuous, but as I see it, you've got a group of physicians, and I know it's a stereotypical thing to say, but physicians in general, particularly acute care physicians that are operating on people, they're usually very confident, often arrogant, very busy, very, I know everything. I'm not really interested in hearing anyone else's opinion about much. And so you've got your hands full, not only listening to these physicians, but making suggestions and getting them to kind of buy into your suggestions, whether it's attending an event or just listening to your opinion. Have I described that correctly? So I think another thing that I'm hearing is that if you could bring some stories about just that, how you've had the opportunity to convince this same population, which is highly educated, very confident, very busy, maybe very set in their ways, to come to these peripheral events, because even though you might know how good they would be for them, they might perceive them without the right information as a waste of their time. So what stories can you bring to tell these two young ladies, hey, I've done this before, and here's a particularly juicy story that I'd like to tell you about. Nobody said I could get this guy or this gal to come, and I did. You don't have to tell me the story, but it seems when you're smiling, it seems like what I just said resonates with you. Yeah. So is that material that you just described, would that be considered some of the marketing material you were referring to? Okay. So it's internal marketing. Again, we're kind of outside of my strength when it comes to healthcare, but I think every time you go on an interview, you want to understand, the hot points, the talking points, the stories, a bit about the audience. That's why I've asked you some of these questions, so I understood a little bit more about the role, a little bit more about what the audience is that you're going to be with. It's a challenging audience. Those stories, I think, would be very valuable for you. And if there are metrics in support of the stories in terms of numbers of physicians attending, percentages of attendance, percentages of efficiency, anytime you can bring metrics of performance to the interview, that's beneficial. So I don't know if there exists such a thing in your profession, but I suspect there's probably something that would fall into the category of metrics of performance. This database and the database programmer, that experience of taking a system that was basically non-existent and turning it to one that produced valuable, executable decision-making type numbers. Do you have any insight into whether the hospital has such a system, or is that something you could potentially bring? So even though you couldn't bring such a system because they already have one, you've developed your own. You appreciate such a system, and you know what to do with it. Well, I think it seems clear to me that you're well qualified for the position. So maybe a good thing would be to get into some nuts and bolts, and then I can answer whatever questions you might have after that. What about compensation? Do you know, is there a range? How have they framed compensation, if at all, up to this point? I think generally speaking, so you don't have any information, but you've given them some information, and they asked you for history of compensation. One number. What are you looking for? Just for your own edification and for anyone else's that might be listening, I think, and this, you can't always do this. The systems and the processes in place don't always allow you to do this, but generally speaking, I tell people all the time. Earlier you said don't bring it up. You're never the one to initiate that discussion, ever. That's always inappropriate because it's self-serving. Secondarily, if you have an application to fill out, you typically have two areas in the application. One would be, what are you making now, or what's your last salary from what period of time to what period of time. That's always a direct answer because there are W-2s to support that. There's no reason to talk around that or obfuscate or be anything but direct. Not only because one can validate that, because being honest is the way to do anything. But when it says, what are you looking for on an application, I always tell people there's one of two answers. One is open and the other is negotiable. Because clearly, even in your circumstance right now, there's so much about this job and the responsibilities and the reporting structure and the day-to-day duties and the bonus structure, the benefits, anything else that might fall into the category of compensation that you don't even know yet. That if you give a number, it's premature. It's speculative at best. So, and that's typically what human resources people want, not understanding the bigger context of that, which is, hey, I might take less for these circumstances, but might require more if these are the circumstances, which is a very legitimate stance to take. Unfortunately, they forced you into a box, and you got to jump in the box. But does the rest of that discussion kind of give some perspective to the negotiation of compensation discussion? Well, there's so many things. If you think about it, there's today, right? Like, what are you going to be doing today? And then there's, what are you going to be doing 3 months, 6 months, 12 months from now? And if there's a career path there, if there's a promotion path there, if there are additional responsibilities based on performance that would be granted to you, or there are bonuses or performance-based compensation of some kind, without being able to figure all that stuff in there, you're throwing a dart at a dartboard, right? So maybe there's an opportunity for you during the interview to incorporate some of that into the conversation. But no matter what happens, until someone on their end asks you a question about compensation, you don't volunteer any of this. That's always the case. Same thing holds true for vacation or anything that would be self-serving. Beneficial is not the right word. Self-serving is the right word, right? Once they bring that up, though, you'll have to try and identify and be sensitive to the opportunities, if they present themselves, for you to start talking through some of these other talking points. So even though it's a little bit after the fact, it still doesn't mean you won't have opportunities to have that discussion. And frankly, given this process, if you put a number into that application that was too big, you probably wouldn't be going in there tomorrow. So you got to deal with what you've been given, and I think you did the right thing. In terms of questions that you're bringing with you, we talked a few earlier about some of the questions about stories that you might have to tell, or questions about, tell me what your biggest challenge is that someone like me coming in might be able to help you solve day one, 30 days in, 90 days in. What are your long-term plans? Have you, as per our last discussion, have you developed a list of questions that you're bringing with you? Okay, so let's address that. That's a good question. It's going to come down a lot to how you frame that question, because again, you don't want to be in that position forever. Well, Alex, what do you mean? You just want to come in here and try us out and then get promoted immediately? So you have to be careful that question is more about you having aspirations than being unwilling to do a certain thing for a certain period of time. In other words, you want to earn whatever it is you get next. You just want to have an understanding about what might come next for a high performer. What the future might hold, because it's always based on performance. It's never entitlement. You understand the distinction I'm talking about? Delivery has as much to do with everything. Well, I think the best thing you can do on an interview is to convey. You can tell me all the details you want, because we wouldn't be here if I wasn't qualified to some extent and you weren't interested to some extent. I'm going to come in there and I'm going to show up early. I'm going to stay late. I'm going to work harder than anybody else that you could possibly put into that position, and the cards will fall where they may. The point is, you need to figure out a way to get that across and be genuine and candid about it, as opposed to self-serving or salesy, because the nice thing about most of everything that I'm telling you is the only reason it works really well is because it's true. I don't want you to say anything that's not true, but there's a way to say it, and there's a when to say it. So I would try, just to kind of recap, I would try and get as quickly as possible what their biggest challenge is, what they want the most help with, without saying problem or anything that would be perceived as negative. And then tailor your answer around that, particularly because it seems like you come from an environment where you have really good experience, kind of no matter what that problem is, because you've worked in very similar environments where they didn't have all the tools that the hospital has, and they didn't have the reporting that the hospital has. And I think probably your biggest challenge is going to be getting the doctors to listen to you and getting the doctors to do what you suggest that they do. So you're going to have very good listening skills with them as well, because I don't know, other than being a parent and having interface with lots of physicians with my kids, when you question them, it pisses them off, unless you question them properly at the right time in the right way, because it's in the benefit of your children. And they're always busy. The last time I was with a doctor with my son, he was on the phone. He had somebody behind him asking him questions, and he was administering care to my son at the same time as he was listening to me. So getting a word in edgewise with a quality acute care physician is a challenge in itself. Good. So let me jump in and say, you being able to frame that story, and if I understand it correctly, so in that particular instance, you weren't even part of their entity. You were an outsider and were still able to get an audience with them. That's powerful. I would figure out how to tell that story very specifically, because in this regard, tomorrow, you don't have to be invited in the door. You work there. You were able to come in from the outside and get in the door and get an audience and get them to do some of the things that you suggested that they do. That's a great story. Here, before I forget, and I apologize for interrupting, but the other thing, the segue from that is, do you have any of these physicians or any of these clinic owners or people that are in that sales cycle you just described that you could use as references? Bring those with you. Because it's one thing for you to say, I did this. It's another thing for you to be able to say, just go ask Joey, Susie, and Ricky and hear their phone numbers. They'd love to talk to you about what I just discussed with you. It's instant credibility. And without it, it could be perceived as just a bullshit story. You know what I mean? Not that it is. I'm just saying, one's very powerful, one's and they're both true. That would be really good. Now, let me throw it back to you. Do you have any particular concerns or particular things that you're nervous about tomorrow, that you feel, I wish I knew this, or I'm not prepared for this, or I hope I handle this properly? Anything in specific? Here's what I would say to the first one. Again, you clearly went to LinkedIn and online and wherever else one would go to do research on these two young ladies, and weren't able to find anything out about them. And I was wondering, whatever her name is, I was wondering, Susie, if before we got too far into this, you've seen my resume and had HR give you feedback about who I am. Would it be appropriate for me to say, could you tell me a little bit about your background, or shall we handle that later on in the conversation? And then it's up to her. You've given her an out. and you've also opened the opportunity to get some info before you give some info. So I would do that with both of them. And if you're in the room with both of them, you could make kind of light of that. Hey, I couldn't. You guys are ghosts. I couldn't find you anywhere online. Is at what point would you be comfortable sharing a little bit of your background so I can put this whole thing in perspective? Something like that. Use your own words, but that's how I would approach that. Okay. And in terms of the compensation thing, do you have any insight into the interview process? In other words, are you just going to speak to these two? And if so, or are there others that you might be speaking to? And what happens after this interview? Are there other people to speak to? Are there other steps in the process? So one of the things you really want to come out of there with is as many answers to the question of what are the specific next steps in the process? Because if there are two more steps, then compensation happens in that second of the next steps. It doesn't happen tomorrow at all. You may not talk about compensation at all. You've already told them what it is you're looking for. You may or may not be given the opportunity to diffuse some of that tomorrow. But frankly, compensation likely won't come up at all tomorrow. Now, if it does come up, then you frame it around that whole idea that it'd be nice to know what else is involved in the compensation package. Vacation to 401k contributions to benefits to perks of the job or anything that might afford me the opportunity to make a decision based on all of the compensatory details. And that might be just something you get to say. You don't get an answer, but you get to frame it so that they're like, you know what else that does, Alex? This is like, that just makes you sound smart, because that's what a smart person would do. Factor in everything before he or she made a decision, right? Never bring it up. It may not come up tomorrow at all. The best thing you could do if things go well tomorrow and there are other steps in the process is have an understanding of exactly what those steps are and a timeline. In other words, this is one of the biggest mistakes people make when they go on an interview is everything's done and everybody loves everybody. And they're like, okay, we'll see ya. And you have no idea when someone may or may not follow up with you. And then you get frustrated, and anything you do to reach out to them after that, you're perceived as a pest. The way to leave an interview is, hey, I really want to thank you for your time. And again, use your own words. I hope I conveyed to you the fact that I can bring a lot of value to this job and a lot of enthusiasm because of my previous experience, but as well because of what I like to do and what I believe I'm strong at. What's the next step? Well, Alex, we got a lot of candidates we're going to be talking to, and over the next couple of weeks, and we'll get back to you if we're going to go forward with you. We'll get back to you probably within the next couple of weeks. Well, would it be appropriate then if I were to put you down on the calendar and call you back, say on the 3rd of August in the afternoon on a Thursday, if I haven't heard from you before then? Now you got them in a box. If you call on August 3rd in the afternoon, it's because they gave you permission to, not because you're being a pest. And it might be next week. It might be, hey, let's look at your calendar and see when you can come in next week because we'd love to have you come in for a final. Be specific. Does that make sense? I can't tell you how many people have come to me after an interview and said, they haven't called me back. What should I do? And I'm like, well, how did you leave it with them? Well, what do you mean? What do you mean? What do I mean? If you didn't set a specific expectation, then I'm sorry. I'd be aggressive in calling them back, but I can't, keep you from being perceived as a pest because you dropped the ball on that specific expectation at the end. Did I frame that properly? Did I say that specifically? But in that scenario right there, there's an additional statement that I would advise that you make, which is, so if I haven't heard from you by Friday afternoon of next week, say 2:00, shall I give you a call? Sounds good. Okay, I'm going to put that in my calendar. And certainly if you want to get back to me before then, I'd love to hear from you because I really think I could bring some value to this job and I'd love to come work with you guys. Which is the last part of the advice, which is, at least until questions, which is ask for the job. Most people don't. Well, most people don't. Most people say, hey, thanks very much for your time. And if there's two people that are in close competition for the job, and one of them asks for the job and the other one says thank you, that person's getting the job. I've hired thousands of people. I promise you that's the truth. Don't leave that thread hanging. Okay, so was that helpful? That exercise? Yeah. The earlier can get that in there and get the answer, I think that paves the way for the entire rest of the conversation. But I think you got some great qualifications based on what you've told me about the job and your experience. I think it's beholden of you to bring very specific stories that support that. I think supporting the stories with specific references with people and contact information is powerful, and then the compensation discussion or lack thereof, always driven by them, never by you, and try and paint that holistic picture around compensation so you can take that number you gave them and maybe give it a little flexibility, and then asking for the job and leaving with a very, very, very specific understanding of what the next step is. That's kind of in a nutshell. What did I leave out, or what else can I help you with? Why don't I give you a call? You, you're still giving them the opportunity to say no, but when you say something to somebody and you ask them, they can say no. If you suggest to them, they're less likely to say no. They're just more likely to go, sounds good. And all of this falls into the category of, Alex, and as I'm listening to you and I'm listening to myself, is you're just trying to make it easier for them to hire you, making it not really about a decision. They're just like validating what you're telling them. That's big. Because I tell you, I've told you this before. People hate looking at resumes, and they hate conducting interviews. It's a pain in the ass. So just make it easy for them. You know. Is there anything else I can answer before we just conclude this call? Well, I tell you what. I know you were doing this recording as a favor to me. I know the circumstances, the environment's kind of noisy, and the connection. And this is my first time with Google Hangouts, but I think the next one we do, and I'm happy to help, whether it's feedback on the interview or preparation for the next interview. Maybe we do it. You stay at your place, I'll stay at my place, with a quieter background. I can see lots of people that might be able to benefit from it. And so, but great exercise, and thank you. And we can hang up now and chat a little bit about whatever else might be on your mind. But thanks, Alex, and good luck tomorrow.